New Zag Khalif Battle has come off the bench about 2/3 of the time throughout his college career. Will that be the case once again now that he's with Mark Few and the Gonzaga Bulldogs?
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Happy Tuesday and welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by FanDuel. Folks, make every moment more. Right now, new customers who join today will get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150 win or lose. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon today to get started. All right, folks, it is a mailbag edition of the Locked On Zags podcast. We're planning to do that on Monday, but of course, we got the news late on Sunday evening that Khalif Battle is committing to Gonzaga out of the transfer portal. Some of the questions are Khalif Battle related. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about some other things this team needs to do to be championship ready. We're also going to discuss Michael Ajayi getting invited to the NBA draft combine, what that means for him. Anton Watson was left off the invitation list, is instead invited to the G League combine. We'll talk about what that means for him as well. But we're going to start with some mailbag questions here. This one was submitted by Austin via Discord. It was submitted as if in a theoretical world where Khalif Battle signed with Gonzaga. We're obviously going to take it now that we know Battle has signed with Gonzaga. The question from Austin is, now that Battle has signed, do you think he could push for a starting role, or do you think he is set as a bench player? I will tell you what I know about Mark Few and the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Nothing is set. I can guarantee you that Mark Few is not promising anybody a starting spot on the roster next season. That includes Ryan Nembhard, that includes Nolan Hickman, that includes Graham Ike. Now, will those guys who started the majority or every game last year continue to start next year? Almost certainly. But there's no way that the conversation that Gonzaga had with Khalif Battle when they recruited him was, hey, you're certainly, no doubt, unquestionably 100% going to be a bench player for us next year. There's just no way that was the conversation. No player wants to be told that, even if Battle has primarily come off the bench in his career. That's still not how this conversation happened. I suspect that Khalif Battle was told he will compete for a spot in Gonzaga's starting lineup. I also suspect that Khalif Battle is a smart person who looked at Gonzaga's roster, who is familiar with the players on the roster, who probably met many of those players face-to-face, and is aware that Ryan Nembhard is entering his senior year as a potential All-American caliber starting point guard, that Nolan Hickman has been in the program for many years, that Mark Few almost never benches players who have been multi-year starters going into their senior year. All of this is likely things that Khalif Battle is aware of, whether he was directly told or not. I believe that Khalif Battle is under the impression that he can compete for a starting role, which is true. I don't think that's wrong. But that there is an understanding or kind of an expectation that part of the value he can bring to Gonzaga is as a high-level scorer off the bench. I talked about this on last Thursday's episode when Battle was a theoretical addition for Gonzaga. I talked about it on Monday's episode after we learned that Battle had in fact committed to Gonzaga. I believe he is going to play a lot of minutes. Battle will be the sixth man for Gonzaga, but it would not surprise me at all if he is higher than sixth in terms of total minutes played next year or minutes per game on average. He could be fourth. That wouldn't surprise me at all. I think Gonzaga is going to play a lot of three-guard lineups next year. I think that's the way that the roster is currently constructed. I think you're going to see a lot of Hickman, Nembhard, and Battle all on the floor together, whether that's paired with Ben Gregg and Graham Ike, who I'm expecting to be the starting front court, whether that's paired with Michael Ajayi sliding up to play more minutes at the 4, with Graham Ike at the 5, with Braden Huff at the 5, potentially even with Ben Gregg up at the 5. I think that this addition, interestingly, adding a guard is probably it's not taking minutes away from Hickman and Nembhard as much as I think it's taking minutes away potentially from a little bit Michael Ajayi, a little bit Ben Gregg, maybe a little bit Graham Ike and Braden Huff, maybe a little bit Dusty Stromer, maybe a little bit Steele Venters. Honestly, I think that Battle's going to kind of absorb a handful of minutes from every player. This is a net good. This is a good thing for Gonzaga because, again, The reason that teams don't play 9 deep very often is because if you're playing your 9th man 10, 15 minutes per game, that's 10 to 15 minutes per game that your 3rd or 4th or 5th or 6th man is not playing. It's really that simple. If you have 10 players who are all equal in skill, you either have the greatest college basketball team ever assembled, or you have a fairly mediocre team. That's the honest truth. And for Gonzaga right now, they have 9 players who need to play on this team, but they're not equal necessarily. And so I think you're going to see Mark Few and Gonzaga going to have to mix and match and figure out what works. What worked against this team may not work against this team, et cetera, et cetera. But Khalif Battle is here primarily to be a microwave scorer off the bench. That's what I believe. That's what the majority of the fan base believes as well. That's what I think is generally the expectation, even among the players and the coaching staff. But it's not set in stone. And it won't be set in stone. That's just not how it's going to work. Khalif Battle, shortly after committing to Gonzaga, posted on Twitter, or actually it was a couple weeks ago, but it started circulating after he committed to Gonzaga. He tweeted, simply put, "I want to be the best guard in the country next year," or "I'm going to be the best guard in the country." I'm paraphrasing. I don't remember the exact tweet, but he truly believes that. And if he truly believes that, he doesn't believe that he's going to come off the bench for Gonzaga next year. And that's okay. That's okay, provided that there's not some significant animosity. But if he wanted to, no doubt, unquestionably start next season, he wouldn't have come to Gonzaga. So I think that this is a net good thing for Gonzaga. I think it's good that he's here. Obviously, he's incredibly talented. Anytime you can add a player of his pedigree, of his success to your program who's willing to come in and play that role, you got to feel pretty good about it. I think if Khalif Battle wasn't willing to play the role that we're kind of perceiving for him, he wouldn't have committed to Gonzaga in the first place. So my expectation is that he's going to compete as hard as he can, and Mark Few is going to legitimately give him an opportunity to step into a starting role next year. But ultimately, I suspect that he will end up being the first player off the bench and playing a very big role. We've seen this with Joel Ayayi. We've seen this with Admon Giller. Those guys kind of flipped, but when one was starting, the other one was still playing big minutes off the bench. We saw with Andrew Nembhard when he got eligible at the last minute, he basically was playing big minutes as a bench player before he eventually just stepped into the starting lineup. Maybe that'll happen with Battle down the stretch this year. Who knows? But I expect he's going to play big minutes, just not necessarily as a member of the starting lineup. Next question here comes from Marky Mark 406 on Twitter, on Discord, who says, "Gonzaga's roster is set up for another successful year. What do we need to push? What do we need to do to push into the national championship contention? What critical continued development of existing players, new player additions, scheme adjustments, etc. do you feel are necessary?" Yeah, so I think Gonzaga's rotation is pretty set. I don't think Gonzaga's path to a national championship requires more player additions, because I don't think they have room to play more players. I think they will make more additions. I think they will at least add one more scholarship player, whether it's a 4th guard, whether it's a 4th or 5th big, a shot blocker, a young big, potentially, whatever it may be. I'm not sure, but I don't think that player is the missing piece necessarily. I think if Gonzaga is going to win a national championship next year, it's with the 9 guys that they have right now. But the things that we would need to see: improved defense from the post, whether that's Braden Huff, Ben Gregg, Graham Ike, somebody stepping up to be a better low post defender. We've talked about Gonzaga's lack of rim protection. I don't think Gonzaga needs somebody to average 2+ blocks per game in order to win a national championship. It's not that cut and dry of like they're not blocking enough shots, they're not going to win a championship. I don't think that it is that necessary. But they need to improve as a post defensive team collectively. Whether that's schematic changes, I doubt it. It could be, but I would be surprised if it's that. Whether it's just improvements for the players. And I think that we're expecting to see that. Graham Ike has only had 1 year of familiarity with Gonzaga's system. The amount of bigs who are successful defensively their first year at Gonzaga is very slim. Very slim. Chet Holmgren is an incredible anomaly. And I know people will say, well, what about Brandon Clark? Brandon Clark had been at Gonzaga for a year, redshirting. So he had that familiarity. He still also is an absolute freak in terms of how great he was defensively his first year playing in Gonzaga's system. But most of Gonzaga's other solid post defensive players, whether it's Shemek Karnowski or Rob Sacre or et cetera, have gotten there over time. Braden Huff has now spent 2 years in the system, one as a redshirt, one actually playing on the floor. And we saw him improve as the year went on. Ben Gregg's in his 4th season. Graham Ike is now entering his 2nd season in the system. They don't need all 3 of them to dramatically improve as rim protectors, but they need at least one of them to kind of get to the point where you can rely on them to be an anchor defensively for this team. The other thing they need is increased efficiency as a 3-point shooting team. Consistent three-point shooting is a massive, massive key for this team. And the additions that they have made this offseason should help in that regard. Khalif Battle is not like a 40+% three-point shooter, but he is a good three-point shooter who I expect to have better efficiency in Gonzaga's offense than he has had historically. He's about a 35% shooter the last couple of years. I wouldn't be surprised if that's much closer to 40 this upcoming year. Steele Venters healthy is really important. I don't know that he's going to be a big minute player because of the additions Gonzaga's made, because he's coming off of a very serious ACL injury, but he is a lights down, knock him down three-point shooter, and that will be valuable for Gonzaga. Additionally, improved efficiency from Braden Huff, from Ben Gregg, from Dusty Stromer, from Brian Nembhard and Nolan Hickman. Hickman was already great last year, but if they can improve, if Michael Ajayi, who was a good three-point shooter last year, but in a limited role or in a limited attempts as a three-point shooter, if he can stay efficient while improving his attempts, that could be a huge key for Gonzaga. If they improve as a three-point shooting team, if they improve on their defensive, their rim protection in particular, and if they just run and run and run. If Mark Few's willing to play 9 deep, he won't every game, but in games where he can, play 9 deep and just run teams to death. If they can do that, knock down their outside shots, defend the rim, this team has a national championship capability written all over them. Another factor for Gonzaga is that they're a team full of seniors. But what I want to talk about now is, what does that mean for the future? What does that mean after the upcoming 2024-25 season? We're going to discuss that in just a second. Right after I tell you that today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Folks, it is playoff time in the NBA and in the NHL. Baseball is in full swing, and FanDuel is your place to bet on every single game. Right now, new customers will get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150 win or lose. So bet on everything from slap shots to home runs to slam dunks, all on an app that is safe, secure, and super easy to use. And folks, if you've been listening to the show, you know that Gonzaga's odds of winning the 2025 national championship began at plus 3,000 for the last few weeks. They've been plus 2,500. Today, their odds are down to plus 1,800. So if you're trying to capitalize, you want to maximize the amount of money that you can make betting on the Zags to take home their first national championship in 2025, then what are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon right now and make your first bet an automatic W. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast. We're still going through Mailbag Monday here. Had a handful of questions that we didn't get to for Monday's show because we were talking about Khalif Battle. So instead, we're going to talk about them here on Mailbag Tuesday, I suppose, is the best way to call it. Question here is another one from our guy, Austin, via Discord. Austin says, with how this year's roster is shaped up, meaning a lot of seniors, are you concerned with what the following year might look like with all those pieces gone? No. Me personally, am I concerned about the upcoming, or not even the upcoming college basketball season, the season after that? No, I don't have the capacity to be concerned about that right now. I don't think anybody should be overly concerned about that right now, but I do want to talk about it. And I do think it's a good thing to talk about, because here's the situation. Ryan Nembhard, Nolan Hickman, Michael Ajayi, Ben Gregg, and Khalif Battle. That is a tremendous group of players. In fact, I mentioned that as a specific lineup that Gonzaga could run out next year, with Gregg at the 5, Ajayi at the 4, and the 3 guards, Hickman, Battle, and Nembhard all playing at the same time. All 5 of those players are gone. They are in their final season of college basketball eligibility. Not a single one of them is capable of returning, barring an injury or a surprise redshirt or anything like that. The expectation is that all 5 of those players are about to play their final season of college basketball with the Gonzaga Bulldogs in 24-25. That means that Graham Ike, Steele Venters, Dusty Stromer, and Braden Huff will be the 4 key returners for Gonzaga who are expected to play a rotation role this year. That also will include Jun-Suk Yo, who I don't expect to play a particularly big role this year, but if he opts to come back, that would give Gonzaga 5 returners for the 2025-26 season. Obviously, a whole bunch of things can change: transfers, medical red shirts, injuries, NBA draft, whatever. Tons of things can change. That's part of the reason the overall answer to this question is no, I'm not concerned about it, because at the way that the modern college basketball is working, you have to build your roster year to year. There's just not a lot of forward thinking outside of the immediate season that is coming up. That's why somebody like Khalif Battle makes sense for Gonzaga. We're not focused on the future right now. We're focused on this season. So let's go get a guy who's available to us for next year, and we're not going to worry about what that means after that. You know, I'm sure Gonzaga expected at first that Efton Reed would be here for multiple years. He wasn't, and that's okay. That's okay. That's just how it goes. But I think that Gonzaga is building their roster looking at next year and next year only. But Gonzaga is heavily involved in recruiting the freshman or the 2025 incoming class. They have made no additions in the 2024 class. There are no freshmen joining this team on scholarship. Cade Orness is going to be a preferred walk-on who will join the team in the 2024 class, but he is not a scholarship player. But Gonzaga has heavily pursued players like Isaiah Harwell, like Nick Cumenia, like Jalen Harrelson, like Davis Fogel, who they recently made an offer to. Those are players who Gonzaga is pursuing in the 2025 class who would come in and theoretically be potential multi-year guys at Gonzaga, or at least players who are going to help fill the gaps of the losses of Nolan Hickman and Ryan Nembhard and Khalif Battle and everybody else. But here's the deal. Gonzaga is going to fill those spots with transfers. Unless there's a large-scale, sudden, dramatic change to how college basketball operates, which would be very surprising, Gonzaga is going to fill out the 2025-26 roster with transfer portal additions. Hopefully those players will be players that they can put around players like EK Inventors and Stromer and Huff, because those are players who I expect to be valuable pieces to Gonzaga that season, assuming, of course, they all stick around, and that Gonzaga will then add in the backcourt. If Isaiah Harwell commits, that's a huge, monstrous addition for them to have as a player who can step in right away and help fill that gap with those three guards graduating after this year. Gonzaga also may add at least one more player this cycle, and I suspect if they do make a transfer portal addition to fill their 11th scholarship, they have 3 more spots. I think they're only going to fill 1 more. That's my guess, at least. If they fill 1 more scholarship spot, it will be probably with somebody who has multiple years of eligibility left. Not necessarily. Depends who's available to them, who they think fits, what they can kind of make work. But if they go out and find somebody who they can add in, who's not going to play a big role this year, a developmental piece who maybe they think can be a bigger contributor for this team in their second year in Spokane, that might be an addition that they make, and somebody who then is going to be someone that Gonzaga fans can think about being a piece for not just this upcoming season, but the year after that. But ultimately, is it something I'm worried about? No. But it is something that Gonzaga is thinking about, and they are making decisions based on that. But right now, their primary focus is on this upcoming season. Next question here comes from Spicy Lord Wade on Discord, who says, feels like right now RJ Barsh may be our number 1 recruiter. What role do you think is each of our coaches' primary responsibility? Look, if I had a better answer for you, I would tell you it's something that I would like to be able to explore a little bit more. I'd have to talk to members of the coaching staff. If and when I do that, I'd love to be able to revisit this and talk more about the coaching staff's individual responsibilities. I will say this. There is not a hierarchy of recruiting that I am aware of, in the sense that I don't think that Mark Few says, okay, this player is more important to us, so we're going to send RJ. This player is not as important, so we're going to send Steven. This player is super not important, so we're going to send B Mike. Like, that's not how it works. There are connections that are made. Maybe RJ knows somebody. Maybe Steven's better at international or whatever it may be. I think RJ does more of the international stuff, actually. But I do think there are roles. I just don't think it's like 1, 2, 3. It's not stacked that way. I know that Stephen Gentry has been involved in recruiting. I believe it was Davis Fogel who spoke specifically about how he's talked with Coach Stephen Gentry. So I do think that some of the domestic recruiting is being done by Gentry. Maybe more of the international recruiting is being done by RJ. Obviously, some of those top players who are on the East Coast that RJ was familiar with when he was an assistant coach at Florida State, those players are being recruited by Barsh. I know Brian Michelson has had his hand in recruiting as well. In terms of other responsibilities, I know B-Mike's the associate head coach. That usually involves him being more involved in-game stuff, like making sure that guys are getting enough rest and substitution patterns and foul monitoring, things that Mark Few isn't necessarily thinking about when he's more focused on the X's and O's. My suspicion is that B-Mike is kind of involved in that. And I don't know after that. I don't know if there's a coach that has more responsibility with the bigs or with the guards, or if somebody's more in charge of the scouting reports for the opposing team. Obviously, they have video coordinators and GAs who do other parts of those jobs as well. So I don't think that there's this super specific ironclad role for every coach. There is more specific than what I am offering right now because I don't know the specifics there. But I think that a lot of it is just like, hey, this is what needs to get done. You're going to do this. You're going to do this. You're going to do this. And we're just going to kind of go from there. Well, Anton Watson, folks, was once again invited to the NBA G League Combine, but not the NBA Draft Combine, folks. Was this a snub? We're going to talk more about it in just a second. But first, I want to tell you about today's sponsor, Monopoly Go. I've been told I'm a competitive person, and it's true. I have a competitive side just like we all do. And my competitive side, folks, it is a big fan of Monopoly Go. I'm sure you've heard of it. It has been downloaded over 150 million times. It is a crazy twist on Monopoly where you play on not one, but hundreds of different Monopoly boards in crazy locations, building up amazing cities that bring you big money. But the best part is getting to mess with my friends. I can charge them rent on my iconic properties, just like classic Monopoly, but now I can also rob their vaults of riches for myself. And the leaderboards show me who the biggest Monopoly tycoon is. But it's not just my competitive side that loves it. You can team up with friends and people all around the world in timed tournaments to earn huge rewards. So get in the game and join your friends. Download Monopoly Go now free on the App Store or the Google Play Store. All right, folks, closing out the show today, talking about the invitations for the NBA Draft Combine and the NBA G League Combine. We will start with Anton Watson among the 44 players invited to the NBA G League Combine. That list also includes fellow WCC player Adama Alpha-Ball from Santa Clara. It includes Isaac Jones from Washington State. It also includes a pair of Arizona players, KJ Lewis and Caleb Love, among 40 or so other players. But here's the thing. 78 players were invited to the NBA Draft Combine. That includes Michael Ajayi, who we'll talk about momentarily. It includes Jonathan Mobo from San Francisco, who we'll also talk about. It includes Bronny James, which I know is controversial. I don't think it's that big of a deal. People said, he stole a spot from somebody. They invited 76 players last year. They invited 78 this year. Bronny didn't steal a spot. He basically just got an extra invitation. It's just not that big of a deal in my mind. But Anton Watson probably should have been there. Here's the deal, though. Watson has just not really ever generated a lot of momentum as an NBA draft prospect. Despite my best efforts talking about him on the podcast as an NBA player, writing articles for USA Today about him as a player, as a potential NBA player, it just hasn't generated a lot of interest. You go on mock drafts, whether it's through The Ringer or USA Today or ESPN or Fanspo or wherever, you check those mock drafts, he's almost never, ever, ever on them as an actual drafted player. If you check big boards, usually he's in the top 100, but he is somewhere between 80 and 100. It's part of what makes it not a big shock to me that among the 78 players picked for the Combine, he was not one of them, because most draft analysts and people who do this professionally are having him in like the 80s in terms of players in this draft class, which would make him somebody that would get signed after the draft, brought into Summer League, potentially competing for a two-way spot or just a roster spot in the G League, assuming he doesn't choose to then go overseas if he doesn't have a spot in the NBA. That'll be a decision up to him. I do think Watson has a path to an NBA career, and I wish that there was more acknowledgement for that. Now he has an opportunity because the G League Combine is still a legitimate combine. It is still viewed by NBA scouts and analysts and fans, and it is still an opportunity for him to prove what he is capable of as a versatile defensive player who can defend 3, 4, and 5, as a capable offensive player who has more in his bag than just low post scoring, as a solid outside shooter. He wasn't a high volume shooter last year, which I think is giving scouts pause. As they should. You look at his basketball reference page and you see, okay, this dude was an 11% three-point shooter as a freshman. He was like 19 as a sophomore, 22, I think, as a junior. And then all of a sudden, he kept getting a 33% as a senior, and then it was like 40% last year. So it kept improving, but the volume of threes was very low all of those years. So he ultimately just hasn't really taken that many threes and proven that he can do that in a reliable and consistent basis at the next level. If he were to do that, if you were to convince a scout that he could be a capable 38 to 40% three-point shooter on standstill, wide open threes at the NBA level, I think he'd get a look, because the defense is good enough to be a 3-and-D, 6'8", small ball 4, stretch 3, whatever, at the next level. He's not going to be a starter. He's not going to be like an all-star NBA player, but is he capable of being a standstill three-point shooter and good defender who plays a role in the NBA? I think yes. And I think in an incredibly weak draft class, that's worth a second-round pick. I know the players who they're talking about in the second round. Watson, to me, has as good of a chance of sticking in the NBA as any of those guys. And I think whichever team signs him, if he does go undrafted, will be happy that they did, because I think they will be getting something good. But again, Watson may not have gotten invited to the NBA draft combine, but he still could go, because about 6 or so of the players who were invited to the G League combine who will then get an invite to the NBA draft combine. It depends how they do at the G League combine. I don't know exactly who makes the decision, but presumably NBA scouts and general managers, whomever is watching the G League combine, will say, those are the guys that I want to see at the draft combine. Those are the guys that I want to see compete against the guys who we really think are going to get drafted. So Watson could end up being in that conversation. Here are a couple names that I think will be in that conversation. I think Adama Alphabal should have probably gotten invited to the NBA draft combine. And I think if he plays well enough at the G League combine, that he will end up in the draft combine as well. John L. Davis from Florida Atlantic, who has now transferred to Arkansas. I think he's going to come back to college ultimately, but it was a shock to me that he was not invited to the NBA draft combine. And I think he's going to destroy it at the G League combine and get that invitation. Judah Mintz from Syracuse, Wooga Poplar from Miami, two very talented high-scoring guards out of the ACC. Baba Miller from Florida State, very good defensive prospect, has never matured as an offensive player, but I could see him getting that invite to the NBA draft combine as well. Speaking of players who did get that invite, Michael Ajayi, officially invited to the NBA draft combine alongside San Francisco star Jonathan Mobo, the two players from the WCC who were invited to this combine. What does this mean for Ajayi? As I've said continually on the podcast, he does have the ability to stay in the NBA draft process and not come to Gonzaga. He has signed with Gonzaga, so he's not going to pull out of the draft and then re-enter the transfer portal and look for another place to play. He's either going to play at Gonzaga or he's going to forego his college basketball eligibility and stay in the NBA draft process. He is not showing up on mock drafts. He's not showing up on big boards. It seems very unlikely that he's going to get drafted. And it seems very unlikely that he's going to get the feedback necessary to decide to not come back to school, because of the fact that he has played 2 years of junior college and 1 year at Pepperdine. He has not played high-level competition in college basketball yet. He has played against Gonzaga. That's the highest level of competition that he's faced, and St. Mary's. He didn't do very well in those games. So if you're an NBA scout, you're looking at a kid who has dominated at the junior college level and dominated against lower-level opponents in the WCC and in the non-conference for Pepperdine. You're not looking at a kid who has faced a lot of NBA talent and who has not done particularly well against them. This is not me trying to insult Michael Ajayi by any stretch of the imagination. I believe wholeheartedly that he is capable of being an NBA player, but he hasn't proven it yet. And the best way for him to do that is to come start for Gonzaga, play 30 minutes a night, demonstrate more of an ability to shoot the three than he showed at Pepperdine. Show more of, like, he averaged 17 and 10 at Pepperdine. He's not going to average that at Gonzaga, but if he averages 14 and 8, on 37% three-point shooting on 3.5 to 4 attempts per game, that's probably enough. That's probably enough. Now, if he goes to the NBA draft combine and just dominates and is going up against dudes like Cody Williams and Stephon Castle and other high-level NBA draft prospects, and he's looking as good or better than them, and I don't think this is super likely, but if it happens, if he just has the best week of his life, dominates the athletic testing, his vertical is really good, his wingspan's fantastic, the interviews, he kills through those, he does great in the scrimmages, and scouts are saying, hey, if you follow us at 34, we're going to consider you. You follow us at 37, we're going to consider you. And he's starting to get all this feedback and buzz, then yeah, he might be gone. I don't want to pretend that that's not a possibility, because it is. I maintain that it is unlikely. I maintain that scouts are most likely going to tell him, we want to see what you can do at a full season at Gonzaga, where you'll get opportunities to play against high-level opponents like UConn and like like the teams they're going to play in Atlantis and like whoever else they end up playing in the non-conference. And you're going to play in the NCAA tournament, and we want to see that. And I think that's the feedback he's going to get, and I think that's why he's ultimately going to return to school. But anything can happen. And if he absolutely destroys it at the combine and leaves, that's a bummer. It's a bummer for Gonzaga, but they're kind of prepared for that. They're in a spot where they're okay if that ends up happening. We'll track it. We'll follow it. We'll follow how Watson does at the G League Combine. We'll follow how Ajayi does at the NBA Draft Combine. That's going to be a lot of the content we got coming forward, because there's probably not a lot of additions coming for this Gonzaga team. So we're going to be focused on the NBA Draft. We're going to be focused on the rest of the baseball season, some of the women's transfer portal additions. We're going to talk about that on a future episode as well. All that coming up in the upcoming weeks here on the Locked On Zags podcast. So hang with us. Thanks to all of you who have made this show your first listen or your first watch of the day, and who continue to do so here in the college college basketball offseason. I sincerely appreciate it very much. So thank you for sticking around with us. We'll be back on Wednesday, with another episode talking about some transfer portal options for Gonzaga, talking about the women's basketball's latest edition as well. All that coming up on Wednesday. Thanks again for listening. And until next time, as always, go Zags.